why would you prioritize this version of anarcho-capitalism over anarcho-communism over capitalism or what we have today?
So I would say what we have today, there are many violations of people's rights going on. So there's taxation. Taxation is theft. So that's a big no-go for me. I'd like to have that gone away with. There is all manner of massive infringements of people's rights by the government, mainly.
Sure, but if, for example, you have some restriction of rights that prevents a greater restriction of rights, wouldn't that be justified? So, for example, putting a murderer in prison to stop him from killing more people, it's justified to put him in prison, right?
Well, I would say it would never be justified to violate someone's rights, but there are, you can engage in punishment of criminals. So if I go and stab someone, then, for instance, you'd be allowed to stab me back because I have essentially, it's through this theory called estoppel. So punishment theory is made up of two parts. There is retribution and restitution. So the restitution would be something like, I take $5 from you, you still own those $5, so I'd have to restitute you. So I'd have to give that money back to you. Restore your property to its initial state before I arrest on you. And then the retribution would be you'd be allowed to take another $5 from me. And that's how we define what the correct punishment for any given crime is. Now, the criminal and the victim, they might negotiate some different sort of crime. So, the criminal might not have $10 to give you. So then they'd be like, well, instead I'll work on your farm for a day. And then if they both agree on that, then that can be the punishment.
Well, the question is more like, isn't it justified to infringe on some people's rights if it will protect a larger majority of other people's rights?
No, because I don't think I think it would be contradictory to say it would ever be just to infringe on rights. No matter, you can imagine if I rob one person, I might prevent 3 robberies down the line. It's still not just to rob that person. That's still an infringement of rights, and any infringement of rights is unjust.
Right. So I agree on morality that it's still immoral to put someone in prison or whatever against their will, but it's justified in that it's an immoral action that you're doing to prevent a greater immoral action. So say we're on a ship, we have enough food to feed 10 people, but there's 20 people, we have to choose which 10 are going to die. No one wants to limit their amount of food. So we're going to have to take food from some to keep the group alive as a whole. That's immoral. I grant it's immoral, but sometimes it's necessary to do immoral things because we live in an immoral world. So in your model, how can you decide which immoral things we need to do in order to sustain the society?
Well, I would say basically libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism is setting forth the law, i.e. there might be certain things which are immoral, but does anybody have a right to do anything about it? So it's basically, what do you have a right to do? So, it might be immoral to keep this food from people, but the real question is, do you have a right to allocate the food in some given way? Who owns the food? And if somebody owns the food, then they have a right to decide who gets it. And, we might dislike how they allocate the food, but at the end of the day, that is their right.
So it's a more general question. Suppose everyone owns 1 unit of food, but it requires 1.5 to feed a person. So no one has enough food to survive. That in this system, we're going to have to take food from people to keep everyone alive. How do you do that under your model?
Well, you wouldn't. If it was the case where the only way to stay alive is to violate someone's rights, then you shouldn't stay alive. You should die.
Well, that seems to be like just reality, like hunting. Like the whole point of animals killing other animals is that for one to survive, predators have to kill the prey. So it seems like your model has a big weakness there in that it doesn't acknowledge reality.
Well, no, this does acknowledge the fact of scarcity in nature, the fact that that there are scarce goods out there, and that, one man going out and hunting a deer and eating it means that other men can't do the same thing. But the real question is, okay, so we've got scarcity, so how are we going to deal with scarcity? So we're going to be trying to avoid these conflicts where, one man is trying to use it for X and another man is trying to use it for Y, and they can't both happen at the same time. So the anarcho-capitalist just takes that to extreme. It says, okay, let's always avoid conflicts. Let's never have any of these conflicts.
But it's just not possible to do that. Like, it seems like in reality, those conflicts naturally occur, and that more importantly, it's sometimes good to have those conflicts. For example, stoplights. Stoplights are an infringement on people's freedom to drive whatever speed they want, but it ends up saving more people's lives. So we know from the data, if we take away stoplights, increases the amount of deaths from car accidents. Same with taxation. Taxation is when you're used. Taxing people actually saves more lives than it kills, and so taxing people is justified, because if we take money from the rich and the wealthy and give it to healthcare and health insurance and things, it increases the life expectancy of people in the country. And so even though it's immoral because it's stealing, I agree, taxation is theft, it's still justified. It's a justified immoral action, because that one immoral action ends up saving more other people, which is 10 moral actions.
I mean, I disagree that it would be justified. Like, you know, for the stoplight example, if you own a road, you're allowed to put out a stoplight, and, you know, people agree to go by the rules of your road when they're using it. So that's perfectly fine. And, you know, if the stoplight ends up saving people's lives, then I think more people would choose your road over their competitors. But then we get into taxation. Taxation is essentially a necessarily decivilizing activity, because you're expropriating. Taxation is necessarily going to be expropriation of either producers, homesteaders, or traders. So producers, those are people who use some previous property and made it into something new. Homesteaders are people who see something in nature and take it out of nature and make it useful for humans. And traders are people who trade. So that's the only ways you can acquire property. So taxation is necessarily going to be taking property from those activities, which is necessarily going to be a disincentive on producing, homesteading, and trading. But producing, homesteading, and trading are also those activities which will tend to lower people's time preference over time. And so you're going to essentially enact a tendency for time preference to raise over time. Do you know what time preference means, by the way? I don't know if I...
I'm familiar with it, but I'm not sure how that relates to my question. So my question is, like, if we have two societies, one that forces taxation, but then uses that taxation to provide a healthcare system, then that society's quality of life and life expectancy will be higher than a society that doesn't have that. So less taxation, but no government healthcare system, their life expectancy will be lower. And so if I'm running a government, even though I know taxation is theft, I see a society where taxation occurs and is then used to some public benefit as an objectively better society with objectively better measurable outcomes. Shouldn't I pick the one that has the better outcomes, even though it might have an immoral action of taking people's money?
Well, like, that's my point here, is I would dispute that it would end up better, because you have this tendency for time preference to go up, and, you know, if you end up taxing enough, then you're going to have really high time preferences. So people looking just in the present, and, you know, people who are just looking in the present, that's not how you get this big complicated division of labor and, you know, all these great societies we have. You're not going to have, you know, pencils being made if everybody's just thinking about the here and now. They're just going to be like, okay, right now I want food. I'm just going to go out and get food. And, you know, my neighbor's got a sandwich there. I'm going to stab him because I don't care about the consequences that might come about tomorrow because of that. This is why Hoppe describes this as a decivilizing tendency. And, you know, let's say there is some way which you could somehow divine that this tax will improve the quality of life. Well, I mean, the quality of life for who, right? Because this is basically, I suspect it would go into some sort of interpersonal comparison of utility, because it's not going to be better for those people who you're taxing, because they would have preferred to have the tax money themselves. So by their own estimation, their utility is going down. So, you know, it's a redistribution.
Sure, but I would compare it to, like, if we're comparing two different countries, which country has the most people, most working people, highest GDP, highest life expectancy, highest quality of life? I would just do it based off of the world happiness standard. They have some very good criterion to go off of. And I'd say that if we can raise that for the whole country to a higher degree than another country that uses a different method, then that's a proven method that it works at a higher rate than a different method. And it seems like we can use past historical data to assess whether or not these models work. So you would agree that governments have gotten bigger over time,
Yeah.
right? So governments get bigger, but health and life expectancy goes up because of government programs. Like it seems like in countries that have massive healthcare programs that are at least decent, unlike America, which is garbage. Even in America, it's still we have a higher life expectancy because of their public healthcare programs. The quality of life goes up for everyone in the country. Life expectancy goes up for everyone in the country. GDP goes up for everyone in the country. So I'm not. If we just look at the historical data, it seems like having this kind of tax-based programs provably have a positive impact, which is why most successful companies use them, or successful countries, not companies. And if your model was better in some way, it would seem like, simply from an evolutionary standpoint, that model would be more prevalent in countries around the world. And so the fact that countries don't have that seems to be good evidence that it's probably not as good of a model.
Well, I mean, the thing is with the state is it doesn't live or die by, market demand or anything like that. So if a state's super inefficient, it doesn't mean that it dies out, right? Because it doesn't need to be efficient in order to keep going, because it can just keep expropriating wealth. So I don't think this evolutionary play out would really happen that way. And, your point there earlier was that, well, life expectancy is going up whilst all these governments are growing. But I would say, well, how do you know that it's because government is growing that life expectancy is going up and not some other variable? Why isn't it? How do we know that it's not going up in spite of the government growing? Because that's certainly possible, and the Austrians would point out that it's definitely the case, because expropriation is going to, raise time preference. It's going to fuck up the entire division of labor. It's going to fuck up everybody's lives and well-being.
I'm not following your argument there. So it seems to me the case that life expectancy is going up because government programs invest in public health care, and that's what increases the life expectancy, and scientific technology and scientific discovery and investments into scientific research that wouldn't happen otherwise. And then we can compare it to countries that have smaller governments or don't have as big government programs, especially in healthcare, and realize, oh, look, it doesn't work as well. They have smaller government and less government programs and lower life expectancy. That seems like a pretty good way to assess. If we just take all the data from all the different countries, see which ones have the biggest government and the smallest government, and which ones have the best health, safety, happiness of pretty much every standard. It seems like the countries that have lots of litigation seem to be doing the best. Like, for example, India's roads are not very well maintained with legal structures, not like a lot of laws. You can just do whatever you want, essentially. And they have a lot more car accidents than we do. And so we can say, oh, look, this system where you don't have a lot of regulation on the roads objectively has worse outcomes. They get into more crashes. And so having more laws has the benefit of less people crashing to death. And it's not like people in India are like, oh, the roads in America are better, let's just use the roads in America, because they don't really have that option. It's not really something that they can just choose to do. You can't just like buy your own road and start to implement laws, because you're going to need a police force or something to like support those laws. It's not really something individuals can do. So if we just look at any individual program, healthcare, taxation, roads, whatever, and compare the outcome of countries that have large governments that enforce stringent laws that might be immoral, and see what are the effects of these laws. And we can test it in how those laws, what effect they had over time in that country as they were implemented, more or less. And so we can know for a fact that these laws are the causal result, or the better life expectancy is the causal result of these laws, because we can look in the exact same country and see what it was like prior to those laws, or with less stringent laws or whatever, and compare that to other countries. Same thing. We can go like, what was the healthcare like in Britain before the NHS, after the NHS? Oh, it was significantly better after the NHS. Same with America's healthcare system, the Medicaid and Medicare. Same with all the different healthcare systems in every single Western country. We can say, was healthcare better before or after these things? And we can say, yes, they were better after, always, in every case, pretty much 100%. And that, so having government programs forcibly pay for these things through taxation seems to be demonstrably a successful metric for improving the quality of lives of the people in the country.
Right, but it'd be like if, tomorrow some meteor landed and wiped out half the US, and then, after this meteor had landed, everybody just for some reason decides that they want to start having way more babies, right? Everybody around the world starts having way more babies. Then you look like, a century down the line, you go, whoa, there are way more humans after the meteor than there were before the meteor, right? So it must be that meteors are good for human life. That's the same sort of reasoning which is going on here. It's like, well, before this government policy was implemented, this was the life expectancy, and after, well, this is the life expectancy, so therefore it must have been the government policy being implemented which increased the life expectancy. This is the same faulty reasoning which goes into all manner of empiricism in economics, which is why I think empiricism is flawed in economics. Economics is an a priori science.
Well, you can make that argument about the problem of induction just for literally any kind of association for literally anything. You could say that all causation is just fake, like Hume did, because we can't prove causation. But that's seems to be a pretty extreme argument to deny the effects of healthcare. So, like, we can say, oh, the government invested in research in heart disease and how to cure heart disease, and then we saw less heart disease. It seems like a direct causation thing. Like maybe it's correlation. Maybe it was magical leprechauns that we can't see that were curing heart disease, and our research into heart disease did literally nothing. But that seems like a less plausible explanation than research into heart disease found solutions to cure and improve heart disease, which then led to less heart disease. That seems like a much more plausible explanation in that case. And the same thing seems to apply to life expectancy, because life expectancy isn't just that number on its own. It's all of the different variables that are associated with life expectancy. Cancer curing rate. Government spends its money to find ways to cure cancer. Rate of cancer curing goes up. Cancer is now no longer as fatal. Again, you could just make the argument, maybe that's just causation. Maybe it's just correlation. It's correlation, some random correlation that the government invested in cancer research, and now the rate of cancer death in many different cases is down by like 80%. But it seems like the more scientific, more plausible explanation is cancer research helps us to cure cancer. It seems like a very good investment. And so I don't think simply making the correlation versus causation argument here is a plausible objection to the fact that research into certain diseases does seem to cure those diseases.
Sure, so let's imagine that the government starts taking a whole bunch of funds and investing it in heart disease research. And then, we're getting better at curing heart disease and stuff like that. The question is, what would those funds have been spent on other than heart disease, Because there are all sorts of problems, all sorts of ends which people want to attain, I might want my heart to work better, so I want to, invest in some heart research or whatever. But the government is essentially, there are scarce means, so it's reallocating those scarce means away from other areas towards heart disease. So it might be that, my community is starving and we would want to use this money to invest in a farm. But then the government comes along and says, no, we're taking your money and we're going to invest in heart disease instead. And then, we're going to starve to death. Or, they might take it away from cancer research and put it towards heart disease instead. That's the point with taxation. It's not creating new wealth. These funds that the government's investing, they don't come out of nowhere. It's reallocating scarce means away from different things, toward essentially reallocating away from what people actually want to invest in towards things that they necessarily didn't want to invest in, like, fighter jets and aircraft carriers and stuff like that. They necessarily, I don't want to have a fighter jet, so, why is my money being taken to build fighter jets? That I'd much rather spend it on food and water and stuff like that.
Sure, but I don't see a problem there. So, like in any investment, specifically scientific investments, most people don't want to spend their money on researching how electricity works and electrons. It's not really something most people care about. But progress in that field gave us computers and cell phones and all the technology we have today, which was funded by the government. The government funded this. I forget the famous guy who invented electricity, brought it to the queen, and the queen said, "That's really cool. What could you use it for?" He's like, "I have no idea, but in the future you can tax it," and therefore she funded it. So it seems like the government funding these large programs can lead to massive scientific development that wouldn't happen otherwise, because private sectors don't invest in things that have a high failure rate. So, like if you come up with a business plan that has a 99% chance of failure and you bring it to an angel investor and say, "Please give me money for my 99% chance of failure business," they're going to just laugh in your face. But in research and development, you need that. You need people to invest in those risky ventures in order to find the magical scientific discovery that no one's found yet. And that seems to happen more in government cases where they have billions of dollars to throw at the Large Hadron Collider. And it doesn't seem like the Large Hadron Collider would have been built under any circumstances in the private market, which is why we never saw one in the private market.
Sure. So this is like basically that's the job of the entrepreneur to find these new technologies that might be developed, and they might want to invest in them if they expect that a lot of people will want this new technology. And the real key thing why entrepreneurs would do this better than a government is if an entrepreneur keeps making bad investments, keeps bringing out new technology which people don't actually care about and don't want to use, then he's going to start losing his money. So, these bad entrepreneurs will get weeded out and you'll be left with only really good entrepreneurs. And these really good entrepreneurs will be able to very easily see, well, I think this new crazy technology like the metaverse or, fucking brain implants or whatever, I think people are really going to want this, so I'm going to start investing money in this. If the government does that and they're like, well, I think people will really want some crazy new toilet paper technology, and the government spends like trillions on this new toilet paper technology, people are like, I don't actually want this new toilet paper, I prefer my old toilet paper better. And then it's like, well, oh well, the government's still around, and it doesn't learn from its mistakes there. You don't weed out the government when the government makes bad investments, but you do weed out bad entrepreneurs. So you're going to get far better investments when entrepreneurs are doing it and pegging their own wealth on it.
Well, that's what I'm saying is false. So, like in the case of electricity, when you know, the guy who discovered electricity had no idea what it was used for, there was no practical application. There was no way to make money off of this. Not in his lifetime, ever. Nothing you could do with it. Completely useless for anybody in society. Nobody wanted it. But that invention led to the biggest advances in human discovery ever. So making technological progress has nothing to do with desirability, none whatsoever. Even if no one in society wants to crash electrons together at the speed of light, it doesn't matter what they want. They're just irrelevant. The entire economy is irrelevant. What matters is the scientific progress and the technological progress that can be made through our understanding of physics, which may have some kind of productivity in 100 years, 200 years down the line, has absolutely no use to anybody today. And no one in our lifetime will be affected by this whatsoever. And so the market, the free market, has no reason to invest in this because no one's going to want to buy it. But because 300 years down the line, this is going to be the greatest invention humans have ever come up with and saved millions and billions of lives. This is a worthy investment, regardless of what anybody wants. Who cares what the market wants? Who cares what you personally want to spend your money on? This is an investment that's worth making regardless.
Right, but then you're investing in things people necessarily do not want. And, you bring up electricity. Well, who knows what we could have had if electricity really nobody wanted to invest in it. Who knows what we could have had by now if they had invested in what people actually wanted. And, I think entrepreneurs are quite smart. And if it will only be useful really far down the line, well, that's why, we should lower time preferences, so stop taxing and people will have way lower time preferences. They're going to look way further in the future. It's going to be like, well, my grandkids might be able to get something out of this technology, so I'm going to start funneling money into it. And, because they're doing it in a free market, they can be far more efficient with the research. They're not just going to be getting these cushy government jobs where they just get money funneled to them no matter what. And I mean, I think people like Nikola Tesla come around all the time. People like Elon Musk. Everyone said, well, there's absolutely nobody was thinking about fucking putting brain chips in you or, reusing rockets or anything like that. But then he went ahead and did it, right?
Elon Musk is a terrible example, but brain chips, he invented nothing. Elon Musk invented literally nothing. He's copied everything he's invented. And his reusable rockets actually cost more than what the regular ones do. But different topic. To use your example, like the fact that the government spends money to give people jobs so they can do whatever research they want, gives them the opportunity to do research that they would have to otherwise spend working at a job. And so the investing in scientists so they can spend all their time doing research is the only way to make these kinds of discoveries. That's why we never see these kinds of discoveries in any countries other than the ones where the governments are paying lots of scientists and professors to just spend all their time doing this. Like, it seems disconnected from past history to say that Teslas come up all the time when Teslas are 100% funded by the government. Tesla was funded by the military industrial complex to invent all this stuff, and his funding that allowed him to install this was from government funding. Like, without all that stuff, none of it would have happened. Most of the biggest advancements in technology over the past 80 years have all been massive government programs. Nuclear developments, the Manhattan Project, government programs. Space flight, where we got all of our stuff for cell phones, government programs. Hadron Colliders, government programs. The Hubble Space Telescope, government programs. Like, pretty much every major invention of humans ever in the past several hundred years have been government programs, even from back from like Galileo. Like, who was going to pay this guy to travel around the world? The Queen paid him to do it because it was the government program. We want to see if you can go find more places for us to conquer and get gold and shit. But so it seems that just looking at history, the historical evidence is that most of these kinds of inventions, which don't have any practical application today, but will 200 years in the future, are all things done by government. They're not done by people. There's just no practical application for people to do this. And our psychology, which is given to us by evolution, does not give us the inclinations to want to look down the road that long, which is why we're so bad at climate change. It seems like we need some kind of a government institution that is specifically designed to do this in order to accomplish these goals. And it seems like there's no evidence the free market would ever be able to accomplish this on its own. Like, climate change is a great example. The free market is doing terribly on climate change. And its consumer demand is that oil is cheap. Oil is cheaper. It's easier to buy. People who would need would spend their money on oil so they can get around, so that they're not wasting more money on electric cars because they're more expensive. They can't afford it. The free market's going to choose oil, and which is going to burn the planet. And so we need some institution to invest billions of dollars into research into carbon capturing alternatives. People aren't going to do it because they need the money. They want to spend it on their own kind of things. So what is your solution to that when it seems like all the evidence is against what you're saying?
I mean, I feel like it's a little unfair to the free market to be like, well, all these cool new things are coming out of the government, whilst the government is taking all this money from people, which they could have used for investing in cool new things, which now they can't. So basically, I think the best way to define how technologically developed we are is how high the capital structure raises. So, you know, if you have like these tiny little first order capital goods, they would be things like a spear to get some fish. Some higher order capital goods might be some machine, which makes a machine, which makes a machine, which prints out ham sandwiches, right? You know, the higher order you go, the more technologically developed you are. And if you have government taxing, you're essentially reducing the ability of entrepreneurs to make higher order capital goods. So if we get all these crazy higher order capital goods, we can free up people's times into these crazy pursuits of, you know, let's go off and pop a telescope over here just to see what happens, you know, because I'm so wealthy because I've got all these capital goods at my disposal. And, you know, something like you mentioned there, oil. Well, I mean, how many billions and billions of dollars of oil subsidies have there been? That was the government. The government was like, hey, I like this oil thing. There were electric cars being developed at the same time as petrol cars, but then they were like, the government came in and was like, oh, oil. We're going to go all in on oil. And the government subsidized oil, which pushed out the electric alternatives. Who knows? The free market may have come to decide that, well, electric is better. And, you know, in a true free market, climate change is quite easily solvable. Things like polluting technologies, that's a tort, essentially. You know, if I pollute and I have this factory which is pumping out all this smoke and it comes into your yard and it dirties your shirts whilst they're out drying, and you've got all this dirt on your shirt, you can take them to court and say, hey, look, they dirtied my laundry here. And then get the factory to pay to fix your laundry and to stop polluting. And there are all sorts of anti-polluting technologies that were being developed, and like these little filters that they put in factory chimneys and stuff like that. And it would stop all the horrible stuff getting out, and they'd have to replace this filter every 10 years or so. Then, United States government came along. They wanted to be the best in the world, biggest in the world. They wanted to be this world empire. And, they looked to the other empires, they looked to Britain, they were like, hey, why is Britain a world empire? It's called industry. We need industry. So then they invented the EPA, and then the EPA was like, well, no, we want industry, so this factory has a pollution license. We're allowed to pollute this much, so you're not allowed to get them to stop polluting, because we want to help industry. And that's why we see all this horrible stuff. It's because of government.
Well, two things there that seems to be contradictory statements. One is that government funding doesn't work, yet government funding worked in the case of oil. So I think either you have to admit that government funding does work. It does promote an industry to a significant degree more so than would happen under the free market, such as in the case of oil. Or you can't say that the government funding and subsidies actually did anything. So no, I agree that government subsidies work. That's why we have things like the Large Hadron Collider. And yes, they did fund oil subsidies and sugar subsidies and things like that too. But the important thing is that when government can take the resources of 300 million people who all want to invest in 300 million different things and collectively assign those resources to one project, that one project is going to make more progress than any of the 300 million individual projects will combined. It's just basic funding rules in economics. If you give all of your funding to a single program, that program is going to outcompete all of the other programs. And so having a government entity that can single out specific programs and give them a large amount of funding that can outcompete any other kind of a thing will absolutely have an impact, which is why we see oil subsidies and sugar subsidies having a significant impact on the market. But the same thing applies to science. The scientific subsidies for the Large Hadron Collider and other things also have this positive impact. So if we got rid of the government and each individual was allowed to allocate their resources however they desired, because each individual has different sets of goals, as you mentioned, we wouldn't have a collective drive for particular projects, which would be beneficial. And so this seems to be why we don't have any of these libertarian free market economies that have ever succeeded as a government, because they don't have the ability to invest in large programs which can then be used to take over the world. Whereas governments do have that ability because they can reinvest their resources to military powers or whatever. And that was the second problem I wanted to bring up, is that in this model, you said people can bring corporations to court for dirtying their laundry. We have that ability today. It's just not possible for a number of reasons, but in your system it seems like it would be completely impossible. I don't see how a person with limited money could go to court and get a large corporation to be able to pay a fine when the large corporation has enough money to buy the court. Like, in a free market economy without a strong government that can actually enforce any of these rules, it seems like it's impossible to enforce any of these rules.
I mean, if we're worried about people buying at the court, then surely having one top-level arbitrator right at the top, the government, who gets to decide what the courts do, wouldn't it be difficult to bring the government to court for crimes then? Right, if that's what we're worried about. Wouldn't it be easier if we had a free market of courts, where if, I have a dispute with Jones, and Jones wants to bribe the judge, then I say, no, I'm not going to go to that judge, I'm going to go to a different judge, right? Wouldn't that be easier? Would it be easier or harder to bribe if you only have one court that you need to bribe, or if you have a bunch of courts that you'd have to bribe?
Well, The first part of your question, I would say, is that it's easier to bring the government to court today than a free market of courts. It's having, like, I'm going to bring my judge is my Uncle Bob, your judge is your Uncle Jerry, and we're just going to keep bringing it to our different family member judges, and they're going to rule in our favor. And that's literally what most of human history was like. And so having an independent set of courts never ever works out for anybody. We need some kind of independent situation where there's like a government who can rule over these things, and we have government policy. Suing the government is easier than suing another person in a lot of ways. So we have that ability in our system to sue the government. It happens all the time. Um, so it seems like, given your system, it would be the second thing you asked was, would it be easier to bribe one government court or many smaller courts? Many smaller courts are actually easier to bribe because they're smaller. They require less funding to be bribable. So bribing a court in America is very difficult. It takes a lot of resources to do. But if I wanted to go to Nairobi or something and bribe a bunch of family courts to rule on me on whatever, that's going to be significantly easier. So the number of courts isn't what matters. What matters is the accountability and the scope of resources the courts have. So if the courts are extremely wealthy, then to bribe them is going to take a lot more resources to convince them to go on your side. Whereas if they're very poor, then it's going to take very little resources to convince them to go on your side. And so it's not about the number of courts, it's about the weight of the net income that would be required to incentivize them.
I mean, you said there something about, well, I mean, this is why all of human history has been these big governments where they control all the courts, but that's actually not the case at all. I'm working on a video right now, in fact, I'm just editing it, about Iceland's legal system, medieval Iceland. They called it the Free State period or the Commonwealth period, stuff like that, where essentially the court system was, we would have these chieftains called Gothi, or Gothar plural, and if I had some dispute with you, and we were under the same Gothi, then we'd go to him and he would set up a court called a thing, and, you know, then we'd arbitrate through the thing. Or if we had two different chieftains, then the two different chieftains would come to a neutral party, and these two chieftains would back us up and make their cases for us, and, you know, help us make our cases, rather. And it was a free market of courts back then. Right, so this has been tried, and it lasted for longer than the United States, and even when it collapsed into what they perceived to be completely intolerable violence, you know, the Civil War period, well, the rate of deaths was actually around about the same as the rate of murder in the US right now, and they perceived this to be completely intolerable violence that was so bad they needed to bring in the Norwegian king to take over, right? And so it must have been the case that before the Civil War period, and the Civil War period only came about because of the non-natural law elements in their legal system, rather than the natural law elements. These natural law elements, it created a system where it was so low level of violence that they perceived the standard rate of murder in the US as being completely unseen of before.
Well, two things there. So what you described pretty much sounds like hiring a lawyer and going to a judge in America. I couldn't find any difference in your description of their legal system and the American legal system. There's an impartial judge, and you hire your lawyer guy who is your chieftain, and he helps you make your case. And that sounds like exactly like the American legal system. I don't know how that's any.
The difference is that the judge isn't a big government guy. He isn't employed by. There was like a semi-government going on. It was the Lagretta essentially was their legislator, but the judge wasn't a part of the Lagretta. He was just some guy from the local community who everybody trusted to be able to be a neutral party, right?
And like if the jury.
Well, the jury was essentially, each party would bring a couple of guys that they knew, and then they'd all vote on it. But like the arbitrator, the judge, was just some neutral party. He was just some guy. It wasn't. They didn't go to like this big government and say, "Hey, government bureaucracy, we've got this case and we're bringing it before you." It was just some guy in the community.
It seems backwards. So it seems like it's better to have the jury be the some guy and then the judge be somebody.
Both of them were some guy, and this led to far better legal circumstances than anywhere else at the time.
in the 1200s, right? Something like that.
So from about the late 9th century to about the I think 12th century, 13th century, something like that.
And do you think those are better than the ones we have today?
Yes, massively.
How?
Because it was far closer aligned to natural law than what we have today, where we have a monopolistic arbitrator who decides what goes and what doesn't go. So if I bring my government, the UK government, to court, say, hey, these guys keep robbing me, they're going to be like, get wrecked, leave, right? They're not going to care. They're not going to care that the government's robbing me because they are the government. I have to go to the criminal to arbitrate with. Right? That makes no sense. It would be better if there was a neutral party, so I could bring the criminal organization to this neutral party.
Well, you can. There's the UN. I forget what they're called, but there's like the international courts. They do that.
Right,
But
but that's made up of other governments. It's made up of a bunch of these people who are also engaged in the exact same type of criminal activity.
right. But my question was more about how do we assess if the two court systems have better outcomes? Not like it seems like you're just saying because it fits more with your already believed principle. That's how you assess whether or not it has a better nature to it. But my question is, as an independent party, let's say someone who's trying to figure out, should I adopt the anarcho-capitalist system or should I go with the government-based system? And I want to assess which court system is better in this case. I need to look at the outcomes. Which one has the more fair outcomes, or which one has the better society for health standards or whatever. And so, what criteria would you use other than the fact that it's just fits your principle
Well,
to assess that one is better than the other?
well, the way you would find out which one has the more fair outcomes is you would look to natural law, because natural law is simply the correct ethic as it pertains to how to resolve these disputes. You don't have to go out and test this. It's not empirical. It just is the case that the natural law ethic is the correct one. There are a few different proofs of this. I can give you the Rothbard's proof was essentially along the lines of, well, for an ethic to be a truly human ethic, i.e. an ethic which applies to humans, it has to satisfy a couple different criteria. So it has to be universal, i.e. applies to every human rather than being just subhumans and humans. You know, if it applied to just some class and there are another class. I can actually bring up the full thing if you give me a second. Sorry about this. I didn't have like my full notes for our thing here. Yeah. So, um, so yeah, a human ethic has to satisfy two properties. It has to be universal, so it applies to all of mankind, and it has to actually assure the survival of mankind, because there's absolutely no point in concerning yourself with ethics if every human is dead, right? So you can't have an ethic, every human must die. That's not an ethic for mankind. And so from this, we get to self-ownership. So if it's not the case that person A was the owner of his body and all goods appropriated by him, two possibilities remain. One, another person B is the owner of A and all goods appropriated by A. Or two, all things are universally co-owned, what he describes as the communist ethic. So A and B are equal co-owners of each other and all goods acquired by either party. The first fails on the grounds of not being a universal ethic, because it describes a society of humans and subhumans. And two fails on two separate grounds. First, it would lead to the extinction of humanity, as in order to act, everyone would have to ask everybody else's permission to act, which is itself an action, so nobody could do anything. And co-ownership itself is impossible, to my eye.
So my objection would be is why would I care about either of those things? Like it seems like I don't really care about laws being universal, and I don't really care about prioritizing the survival of humanity. I think that's a pretty low bar. I would say that I would prioritize the flourishing of humanity. I would say that if we're trying to assess which model is better, we would say which one leads to the better society as a whole, not just it keeps human lives. And the universality, I really don't care about. I don't think that's matters.
Right, but if you reject this, then you're essentially rejecting truth. I'd imagine we both cared about truth, right? And that is the basis for, if you have a human ethic, it must at the very least assure the survival of mankind, which no other ethic apart from the NDP can do.
They all do that. All of the ethics ensure the survival of mankind, as far as I'm aware.
Not
so
consistent
far.
ones. They'll be self-contradictory because they won't apply to everybody. You know, you need to have self-ownership if you're going to have the survival of mankind.
The Nazis' strategy caused mankind to survive, even though they killed a lot of people. So even the worst ones don't kill literally everyone. And so continuing mankind is a pretty low bar. But my argument here is more that who cares about the universality? I don't care about this objective moral framework as much as I do the pragmatic implications of a particular model. So if one model...
You still there?
What just happened?
I think you cut out there.
Yes. So if we have one model that is a perfectly moral model, let's say Jainism. Jainism is the closest, I think, to a perfectly moral system. But we have a immoral system like American politics, a horribly immoral system. But the system with American politics leads to a better country with better lifestyles. Then who cares about the morality? It's irrelevant. Pragmatically, we should just forget it. Like, we don't need this subjective moral system. What we need is something that will pragmatically lead to better lives for the people in the society, regardless of whether or not it's moral. And so it seems like you're conflating the objective moral standing of a particular model and its pragmatic application, which are two completely separate things.
Well, it's a contradiction to say we should do something and propose that that thing is immoral. So we have to concern ourselves with ethics here. We have to concern ourselves with whether or not something is moral, because that's, if something's moral, if you're proposing that X is moral, you're proposing that X should be done, or we should do X, something like that. Right? So it's a contradiction to say that we should act immorally.
No, it's not. So, like, for example, I can say you should kill one person to save five. That would be immoral for you to kill the one. It's moral to save the five. And so there's two separate actions there, one immoral and five moral. And so
no,
it's
a one action.
No.
Right, you're saying that I should do something immoral, which is a contradiction.
No, it's not. Should can be a pragmatic implication. You are pragmatically inclined to do this, even though it could be an objectively immoral act. So should is a pragmatic implication. It's not a moral implication.
All right.
It can be used either way.
Do you think I ought to be immoral?
No, I think if you want...
I ought not be immoral. So yeah, I ought not to be immoral, right? And that would have to be the case.
No, so I think there are no categorical imperatives. So if your goal is to be moral, then you ought be moral. If your goal is to be immoral, then you ought be immoral.
Is that not just like the ethics of sophism? Just like do whatever you want, whenever you want. Just go by your whims.
No, morality would still be objective there. If you kill somebody, you're going to be immoral. It's an objective fact of the matter. You're immoral. And so if you want to be immoral, then you ought to be immoral, because it's a hypothetical imperative, not a categorical imperative. So a way to explain this is something moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral?
I think morality is describing what you ought to do, right? It's the science of saying, right, what are man's proper ends, essentially.
Well, try to answer the question as best you can. Is something moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral?
Is something moral because you ought to do it, or you ought to do it because it's moral? Well, you ought to do it because it's moral. I mean, yes. It's the same, right? They're essentially reframings of the same. Because it is moral, you ought to do it, and because you ought to do it, it is moral. It's, X equals Y, because Y equals X. I see it as entirely flippable there.
It's the Euthyphro dilemma. It's the point here is that in the first horn of the dilemma, is something moral because you ought to do it. If you have a category of moral, and inside that category is some set of properties, one of those properties is oughtness. It's going to be inside whatever morality is. It's one of the properties. In the second horn of the dilemma, you ought to do something because it's moral. That means the oughtness is outside of the morality. You have some set of facts. These are this moral set of facts that entail morality. And once you know these, then you apply this other thing, this oughtness, and say, I ought to do this thing because we know it's moral. But the essence of morality is independent of the oughtness. So in the first horn, you ought to do something, or something is moral because you ought to do it, means the oughtness is within the morality. Oughtness is one of the properties that makes something moral. In the second horn of the dilemma, oughtness is outside of morality. So you have a set of properties that make something moral. And once you know those things, then we apply oughtness and say, well, once I know them, we apply this other thing that's completely separate from morality to it.
I suppose this would just be different to how I understand morality. I would just say, if it's the case that you ought to do X, then it's moral to do X. That's how I would understand it. So I suppose maybe the former there would be the best linking to my view, because I think oughts are morality. You know, it's contained within morality.
And that makes it arbitrary. That's why the Euthyphro dilemma, the first horn, is arbitrary. But
I mean, how is it arbitrary? Because if you have certain oughts where, you know, the negation of them would be completely nonsensical and false, we know via the law of non-contradiction that the negation of the negation, i.e. the initial moral premise, has to be true. And I think there are certain moral premises which are true, because the negation of them is patently false.
Well, I don't think the oughts, there's no ought that is like patently true. I think you can just get rid of all oughts and you don't need them for anything. I think oughts are a human thing that we apply once we know. I think moral is, it's like a fact. It's like, say the moon is 255,000 miles away or kilometers away or whatever. That's a fact. There's no ought there. And I think that moral statements are the case. It is wrong to murder babies. I think it's just a fact. I don't think you need any ought. Doesn't matter what you choose to think.
What do you mean when you say something is moral, i.e. it's immoral to murder babies, if it doesn't mean that you ought not murder babies?
I think morality is, again, like a thing in nature, like a law of physics. It is a fact, it is a thing. And so it doesn't correspond to that set of factness.
Right, but what actually is it? Right, I can say, you know, glabaglu is a law of nature. It's just in nature, right? But what does it actually mean? What does it mean to say that it's immoral to murder babies?
I'm saying that there's literally a law of physics that entails some set of facts that are the moral facts, and what you're doing is not in accordance with that law.
So how do you derive that?
I look at moral intuition and moral progress, and I try to find a pattern, describe the pattern with the principle, use the principle to make predictions about what we'll see in the future, and then infer that my hypothesis is correct if those patterns are what we see.
Well, if it's moral intuition, then how is this in any way a law of nature or logic or something like that?
Moral intuition is just a data point that we're trying to use to infer the law. It's not the law. The intuition isn't the law. It's like a piece of information, a piece of data we're using to try and infer what the law is.
Well, then we can maybe just replace morality with oughts here, because I think there are certain ought propositions that are simply false, you know. Something like, I ought never argue. I think that is false because it would be negated by its very proposing. If I were to propose, I ought never argue, I would show that I don't believe it's the case that I ought never argue. So I've contradicted myself. So, you know, we know because of the law of non-contradiction, the negation of I ought never argue, i.e. I ought sometimes argue, has to be true. So I ought sometimes argue has to be true. Has to be an objectively true ethic.
No, it doesn't. Like, what? Like, I would say if you don't like arguing, you ought never argue. That's a very clear, true statement. But the statement you ought argue is obviously not inherently true.
No, you ought sometimes argue, at least sometimes, i.e. As it pertains to argumentation ethics, when you're engaged in a conflict, you ought to argue your way out of this conflict rather than engage in violence.
Well, that's a different statement. So saying you ought sometimes argue is not inherently true. There's nothing inherently true about that.
It is inherently true because the negation of it, you ought never argue, is contradicted by proposing it. You know, if I tried to propose, I ought never argue, would you take me seriously if I said, nobody, you ought never argue. It's wrong to ever argue, right? You'd see that it would be absurd because I'm currently arguing. I'm
No,
currently trying to
it's just-
argue
it's just a
that you
statement
ought
of
never
fact.
argue.
Presenting a statement of fact wouldn't inherently be an argument. No, it wouldn't be a self-contradiction. So a statement of fact that you ought never argue or something isn't itself an argument.
How is that not an argument?
It's a statement of fact. It's not an argument.
You're proposing in argument that you ought never argue.
No, there's a difference between a statement of a fact and an argument. So an argument is like premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Here is some reason, some conclusion that we see. That will be an argument. Saying a statement of fact, the moon is 255,000 miles away, is not an argument. It's not. It's a premise at best.
Well,
So
it's
the premise you ought never argue.
It's certainly a
premise.
proposition. Saying that the moon is X miles away, that's a proposition, an argumentative proposition, right? It could be potentially disputed, right? If I were to right now say the moon is 5 meters away from me right now, right? That's a proposition, and you could argue against it.
Yeah,
Similarly,
but just
you ought
saying
never
the moon-
argue is also a proposition.
It would only be an argument if you presented it as a counter to some other proposition. If you're just making it as a
No,
statement
no,
of fact, it's not an argument.
Like, argumentation is propositions flying left and right. There's going to be some first proposition, and that is, an invocation to argumentation, right? If I just met you in the street and pointed at you and said, you ought never argue, if I'm actually caring about the truth of this proposition, then I'm doing that because I potentially want you to argue back. If I didn't care about you arguing back, then I'm not actually engaged in truth seeking here.
No, that's like false on 3 different levels. So you could simply just be having an epilepsy and have your brain happen to say or you want to say those things. Just
Right,
because you
then
like
it's
to say
not
those
an
things. It has
argument
nothing to do with
though.
arguments.
But then it's not an argument. That's the
Right,
point.
it's just a statement of fact. It's not an
Right,
argument.
but
That's
if
the
I'm
point.
actually trying to state this as a serious proposition, then I am.
It's still not an argument.
If I'm trying, how can you state a proposition without
Like a
outside
teacher
of
in a
argument?
classroom who says the moon is 255,000 miles away. He's not looking to argue. He's not saying, "Oh, you guys can dispute this." He's just giving you the fact. And if someone says, "No, you're wrong," it's like, "Shut up. I'm moving on to the next thing."
Right,
It's not
but
an argument. It's
if
a
he's not
statement of fact.
interested in an argument, if he's not interested in having any disputes of that position, then he's not seriously proposing this in the course of an argumentation. The only way that we
Doesn't make
can,
sense.
the only
Well,
way that,
obviously it's not in the course of an
right,
argumentation.
the
You
only
don't
way,
need to.
the only way that we can get to the truth of a given proposition is by arguing over it. That's how we get to the truth of a proposition.
No.
Do you think we get to the proof? Do you think we don't get to the truth of proposition when we argue over it?
We can, but it wasn't the only way, and it's not relevant to the objection here. So people can make statements of fact. You should not argue, and not intend to argue about it. They're not presenting it to you in hopes that you're arguing about it. They're not presenting it to you in such a way that they want to argue about it. Just a statement of fact, like a teacher who's saying the moon is 255,000 miles away. If you don't agree, shut up. And that's perfectly fine. People do that all the time. That's literally what street preachers do. That's all they do is they yell at you and tell you God is real, and if you don't agree, shut up.
And I don't think these people are really concerned over the truth of their propositions. I think they're just saying them, and they don't care about what counter arguments may come their way because they're not trying to engage in argument, right?
Right.
If you don't care about
there's a difference between caring about the truth and caring about the counter arguments. Those are separate things. They care about the truth. They care that Jesus is real. They don't care about the counter arguments. That's also true. So it is both the case that they care about the truth and that they don't care about the
But
counter arguments.
if they cared about the truth, then why on earth wouldn't they allow counter arguments? Because there might be some information that they don't have yet, right?
Because they have a different epistemology. Like it's not a logical
But they're wrong.
contradiction. That's true. I agree they're wrong, but it's not a logical contradiction.
Like, but it's correct then that if you genuinely care about the truth, then you ought to let some counter arguments into your proposition. That's the whole point of an argument, is you're proposing something as a challenge to others to test it.
If you care about the truth and you've explored epistemologies and found a better epistemology which entails this, then you should include counter arguments. But if you care about truth, but you don't care about arguing, then your epistemology doesn't entail that. There's no logical contradiction there. It's not a logical contradiction to say you should never argue.
There isn't like different epistemologies for different people. There is just correct
there is.
epistemology. People believe in different epistemologies, but there isn't different epistemology. Logic doesn't change between different people, right?
Yes, it does.
logic does not change between different people.
Yeah, there's
there
non-standard
is
logic, fuzzy logic, many-valued logic.
there is simply
quantum
just
logic.
truth, and truth applies across the board. You can
Sure.
other people might believe in wrong things, but that doesn't make them right.
Sure.
Right? So
Epistemologies aren't
there
wrong or
aren't
right,
different
though.
epistemologies. There is just epistemology. There aren't different epistemology for different people.
Epistemology is how we know things. There's definitely different epistemologies. Epistemology isn't a true thing. Epistemology is a method. It's a method to get to truth. There can be definitely different methods to get to truth. No, there's obviously many different
I mean,
epistemologies.
it's
Naturalist
it's
epistemologies,
the philosophy of
epistemologies.
knowledge, right? It's the philosophy of how does one acquire knowledge, and there's going to be a true way of how one acquires knowledge and false ways. Like, imagine I proposed as epistemology, right? Nobody can know anything ever. Well, do I know that? I guess I do know that, right? The sophist epistemology. That's false. It's false on its face because it's claiming to know that nobody knows anything. Sorry, right? So this is a false epistemology. So there can be false epistemologies. So therefore, there's got to be some correct epistemology of how people come to know things.
Yes, and there's multiple different ones, like rationalism
how can you
versus
have
empiricism.
multiple different correct epistemology? There's going to be some superstructure because of metaphysics, which is just correct. There can't be multiple different contradictory truths. There's just going to be truth. If it contradicts another truth, then you don't have two truths. You have a truth and a falsehood, or maybe two falsehoods.
Right. So like one could be I shake a magic 8-ball. So my epistemology is shake a magic 8-ball, and the magic 8-ball says the moon is 255,000 miles away. That is a way to acquire knowledge. I now have knowledge, the distance of the moon. I've used a very strange method to get it.
That's not really an epistemology because it isn't describing how you came to know it.
Shake a magic 8-ball. Magic 8-ball tells me is an epistemology. So if magic 8-ball says so, and whatever it says is true, that's a means to gain knowledge. And so your means to gain knowledge
isn't generally true, surely, right?
The point here is that it could be. It is logically possible to gain knowledge from shaking a magic 8-ball. The point is that there are different kinds of epistemology. Epistemology is just a method. It's just you can make up whatever method you want, and it could potentially work. Pray to God could be a method. So methods don't entail truth. They're just a way to do things to lead to some kind of an idea, and if it has correspondence to reality, then it's knowledge in some way. And if the method does that many times in a row, then it's a justified method. So if you have an 8-ball that gives you the correct information of the lottery tickets 10 times in a row, you have a justified true belief about the next lottery tickets from shaking the magic 8-ball. That would be an epistemology. You have the magic 8-ball epistemology. Right. Epistemologies aren't inherently true.
This magic 8-ball epistemology would surely be incorrect because people don't come to know things through shaking magic 8-balls. They don't. That's not how people in general come to know things, because we are looking for a general philosophy for how people come to know things. Do they do it through reason? Do they do it through fucking observing sense data? How do people come to know things? What is the meta level of this? Like, how did I come to even perceive this or anything like that? Did I reason about it? Did I perceive the magic 8-ball? The meta level.
Well, again, it's hard for me to just explain why epistemology is literally just a method. Like science is a method. There could be different versions of the scientific method. They can all lead to different things or the different truths in different ways, and that's fine. Epistemology isn't true. It literally can't be. It's a method. It cannot be true. Epistemology is not a proposition. It doesn't have truth value. It's a method. But we've been going for about an hour. So I wanted to wrap up pretty soon so I can go biking and get home.
All right, sounds good.
But yeah, I appreciate you coming on. Really, thank you. Would you like to tell people where they can find you and find your work?
Sure. Liquid Zulu. I'm on youtube.com/Liquid Zulu. I do a bunch of debates these days, but I'm going to slow down the debates for a while and produce some actual videos for a bit. And yeah, anarcho-capitalist, yada, yada, yada. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a fun
and your email manager, he's very kind. I like him.
He is magic. He is a magic, just amazing person.
He's a magic 8-ball.
He is my magic 8-ball. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll see you later. Peace out.